The auctioneer's hammer fell with the finality of a coffin nail, and Dashiell Montclair's world shattered like glass hitting stone. $53, that's all Nerissa Rosewood was worth to the crowd of leering men gathered in Weatherford's dusty town square. $53 for the woman who'd taught him that sunrise could be a prayer and that a gentle touch could heal wounds deeper than flesh. Sold to Barnabas Grimm, the auctioneer bellowed, his voice cutting through the afternoon heat like a rusty blade. Dashiell's hands clenched around the fence rail hard enough to splinter wood. He'd arrived in town with $47, burning a hole in his pocket every cent he'd saved from 2 years of ranch work, and it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Not against men like Grimm, who measured wealth in thousands rather than coins scraped together from honest labor. Nerissa stood on the platform in her faded blue dress, her golden hair catching the sun despite the iron shackles around her wrists. She didn't look broken, even now. Her green eyes swept the crowd with quiet dignity, pausing when they found his face in the sea of strangers. For a heartbeat, he saw something flicker their recognition. Hope. Then devastating resignation as Grimm's men moved to claim their purchase. "Move along, cowboy," one of Grimm's hired guns growled, shoving Dashiell back from the platform. "Show's over." The show was just beginning. Dashiell had known Nerissa since she was 16 and he was 18. Both of them working at the Pemberton Ranch where dreams went to die under the relentless Texas sun. She'd been the cook's daughter, he'd been a drifter with nothing but strong hands and a willingness to work. They'd fallen in love the way wildflowers bloomed after rain, quietly. Naturally, inevitably. But love didn't pay debts. When Nerissa's father died owing money to every merchant in 3 counties, she'd inherited his obligations along with his grave. The law in Weatherford was simple. Debts must be satisfied, and a young woman with no family and no protector could satisfy them in only one way. Dashiell watched helplessly as they loaded her into Grimm's wagon like a sack of grain. She looked back once, her lips forming words he couldn't hear, but didn't need to. "I love you." Then the wagon turned the corner, taking her toward Grimm's sprawling cattle empire 20 miles north. And Dashiell was left standing in the dust with his heart in ruins and $47 that might as well have been 47 pieces of silver. "Shame about the girl," said a voice behind him. Dashiell turned to find Doc Henley, Weatherford's only physician, watching the wagon disappear. With troubled eyes, the old man had delivered half the babies in the county and buried the other half, and his face carried the weight of all that witnessing. "She didn't deserve this," Dashiell said, his voice rough as gravel. "Course she didn't. But Grimm's got the law on his side, and the law don't much care about deserving." Doc Henley spit tobacco juice into the dust. "Man like that. He'll use her up and throw her away like a broken tool." Something cold and deadly settled in Dashiell's chest. He'd grown up poor, worked ranches from here to Colorado, seen how men with power treated those without it. But this was different. This was Nerissa, who'd bandaged his cuts and shared her meager meals, who'd kissed him under stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. "Unless someone stops him," Dashiell said quietly. Doc Henley's eyes sharpened. "Boy, I know what you're thinking, but Grimm's got 20 men on his payroll. Men who kill for wages and sleep sound afterward." "Then I better get started," Dashiell replied, checking the Colt at his hip, a gun he'd never drawn in anger but had practiced with until he could split playing cards at 20 paces. "You're talking about war," the doctor warned. "Oh, Dashiell," said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm talking about love." The Grimm Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, like a cancer eating the landscape. Dashiell approached it at sunset, moving through the tall grass with the patience of a predator. He'd spent 3 days watching, learning the rhythms of the place, counting guards and mapping escape routes. 20-3 men, just as Doc Henley had warned. All of them armed, most of them killers who'd found steady work in Barnabas Grimm's private army. The ranch house itself was a fortress of stone and timber, with thick walls and narrow windows. That would make assault suicide for anyone fool enough to try. But Dashiell wasn't planning an assault. He was planning a rescue. He'd found her on the pot. Second day of surveillance, working in the kitchen garden behind the main house. Even at a distance, he could see the changes 3 days had wrought. The proud set of her shoulders had developed a protective curve, and she moved with the careful precision of someone walking on broken glass. Grim hadn't touched her yet. Dashiell could tell by the way she held herself, by the fire that still burned in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, but it was only a matter of time. Men like Grim enjoyed the anticipation almost as much as the conquest. Nerissa, he whispered into the gathering darkness. She was hanging laundry on a line strung between two cottonwood trees, her movements mechanical and distant. At the sound of her name, she froze, then slowly turned toward the fence, where shadows pooled like spilled ink. Dash. The word came out barely audible, a prayer wrapped in desperate hope. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, keeping his voice low. 2 guards patrolled this section of the property, but they wouldn't make their next rounds for another 10 minutes. "You can't." Tears started down her cheeks, silver tracks in the starlight. "There are too many of them. They'll kill you." "Let me worry about that." He reached through the fence, his fingers finding hers. The touch sent electricity through both of them, a reminder of what they'd shared and what they'd stood to lose. Tomorrow. Night. The old oak by the creek bend, midnight. "Can you get there?" "The house is locked at night. There are guards. Can you get there?" He repeated. Nerissa looked back at the ranch house, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that promised nothing but darkness for her future. When she turned back to him, her jaw was set with familiar determination. "Yes," she said. "But Dash, if they catch us, they won't." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Trust me. I've never stopped trusting you." She glanced over her shoulder at the sound of approaching boots. "Go, please. I can't bear to see them hurt you." Dashiell melted back into the darkness just as one of Grim's men rounded the corner of the house. The guard, a scarred brute named Vance, whom Dashiell had seen in town, stopped and studied the laundry line with suspicious eyes. "Who are you talking to, girl?" Vance demanded. "Myself," Nerissa replied, her voice steady despite the fear Dashiell could hear beneath it. "Helps pass the time. Boss don't like chatter. Finish up and get inside." Dashiell watched from the shadows as Nerissa gathered the remaining clothes with quick, efficient movements. Even now, even here, she moved with a grace that made his chest tight with longing and rage. 3 more days and Grim would tire of waiting. 3 more days and the woman he loved would be destroyed by a man who saw her as nothing more than property to be used and discarded. But Dashiell had a plan. It was dangerous, suicidal, Doc Henley would call it, but it was the only chance they had. He'd spent his life savings on supplies, dynamite from the mining company, fast horse from the livery stable, and ammunition enough to fight a small war, because that's exactly what this was going to be. As he crept back toward his hidden camp in the hills, Dashiell allowed himself one look back at the ranch house. Somewhere behind those walls, Nerissa was preparing for bed, probably staring out her window at the same stars he could see. Tomorrow night, if everything went according to plan, they'd be watching those stars together as free people. And if it didn't go according to plan, at least they'd die together rather than live apart. In the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the moon, and Dashiell felt the sound echo in his bones. 24 hours to prepare for the fight of his life. 24 hours to get ready to challenge an empire for the sake of love. He checked his gun one more time and started counting. Bullets. The explosion that shattered the night came from the eastern pasture, a pillar of fire and smoke that lit up the sky like a fallen star. Dashiell watched from his position near the creek as chaos erupted across the Grim ranchmen, shouting, horses screaming, the frantic ring of the dinner bell as guards rushed toward what they thought was the main attack. It was exactly what he'd hoped for. The dynamite he'd planted near the cattle pen had done its work, scattering 200 head of prime beef across the prairie, and drawing 20 of Grim's 23 men away from the house. That left 3 guards, plus Grim himself. Between Dashiell and the woman he'd come to save, better odds than he'd dared hope for. He moved through the darkness like smoke, his boots silent on the soft earth. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar. Nerissa's work, he hoped, though he couldn't be certain. Everything depended on her ability to slip away from whatever room they'd locked her in. To make her way downstairs while the house shook with the distant explosion. The first guard died quietly. Dashiell's knife finding the gap between his ribs. Before the man could cry out, the second tried to raise his rifle but found himself staring down the barrel of Dashiell's Colt instead. "Where is she?" Dashiell asked, his voice carrying the promise of death. "Upstairs," the guard wheezed, his hands raised. "Third door on the right." "But mister, you don't understand what you're—" The gunshot echoed through the house like thunder, and the guard crumpled to the floor. Dashiell had no time for conversation. No patience for explanations. Somewhere above him, Nerissa was waiting. Okay. And every second brought Grimm's men closer to discovering the real target of tonight's attack. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his gun drawn and ready. The third door on the right stood open, revealing a bedroom that spoke of wealth and cruelty in equal measure. Heavy furniture, thick carpets, and bars on the windows that turned luxury into a prison. Nerissa sat on the edge of the bed in a white nightgown that made her look like a ghost of her former self. But when she saw him, color flooded back into her cheeks, and she leaped to her feet with desperate joy. "Dash. I heard the explosion, and I thought no time," he said, catching her hand and pulling her toward the door. "We have to move now." They made it halfway down the stairs before Barnabas Grimm stepped into the front hallway, a double-barreled shotgun in his hands and murder in his eyes. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and soft around the middle, with the kind. A face that had never known hardship or doubt. "Going somewhere?" Grimm asked, his voice deceptively mild. Dashiell pushed Nerissa behind him, his Colt trained on Grimm's chest. "Let us pass, and nobody else has to die. Nobody else." Laugh was like broken glass. "Boy, you killed 2 of my men and scattered my cattle to hell and gone. You think I'm just going to let you walk out of here with my property?" "She's not property," Dashiell said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I paid good money for her. Got the papers to prove it." Grimm's eyes shifted to Nerissa, and his smile turned ugly. "Been looking forward to breaking her improper. Been thinking about it every night since the auction." The words hit Dashiell like physical blows, but he kept his guns steady. "Last chance, Grimm. Step aside. Or what? You'll shoot an unarmed man in his own home. You're not unarmed." Dashiell's voice dropped to a whisper. "And this isn't your home. It's a prison you built on other people's suffering." The shotgun blast and the pistol shot came so close together they sounded like one explosion. Buckshot peppered the wall where Dashiell had been standing, but he'd thrown himself sideways at the last second. His bullet catching Grimm's center mass and spinning the big man around like a child's top. Grimm hit the floor hard, blood spreading across, his white shirt like spilled wine. He tried to raise the shotgun for a second shot, but his strength was leaving him in red rivers. "Double quotes you, ... She gasped. "She ... ain't worth dying for." "You're wrong," Dashiell said quietly, kneeling to check Grimm's pulse. "There wasn't one. She's worth everything." Nerissa stood frozen on the stairs, her face pale as moonlight. "Is he dead?" Dashiell holstered his gun and took her hand again. "Come on. We've got maybe 5 minutes before his men figure out what happened." They ran through the night like escaping spirits, leaving the burning ranch behind them. Dashiell's horse waited, where he'd left it, saddled and ready for the hard ride ahead. But as he lifted Nerissa onto the saddle, she caught his face in her hands. "You came for me," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You actually came. Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped. I prayed. But men like Grimm, they take what they want and keep it." "It's not this time," Dashiell said, swinging up behind her. "Not you. Never you." The thunder of pursuing hoofbeats reached them as they crested the first hill. Behind them, the Grimm ranch burned like a funeral pyre, and ahead lay the vast darkness of the Texas plains, where a man and woman could disappear forever if they were clever enough and desperate enough. They were both the Rio Grande ran red with dawn light as Dashiell and Nerissa finally allowed their exhausted horse to drink. They'd ridden hard through the night, following cattle trails and dry creek beds, staying away from the main roads where Grimm's surviving men might be waiting. Now, with Mexico just a rifle shot away across the muddy water, they faced their first real choice as fugitives. "We could cross," Nerissa said, her voice hoarse from dust and exhaustion. "Start over in a place where Texas law can't reach us." "We could," Dashiell agreed, though something in his tone suggested reluctance. "But that means running forever. Always looking over our shoulders, never knowing if today's the day they catch up." Nerissa studied his profile in the growing light. Seeing the hard lines that 3 days of violence had carved around his eyes, this wasn't the gentle ranch hand she'd fallen in love with. This was a man who'd killed to protect what he valued, who'd turned himself into an outlaw for her sake. "What's the alternative?" she asked. "We make a stand, find somewhere defensible, and wait for them to come." Dashiell's hand rested on his gun, fingers drumming against the worn leather holster. "I killed their boss. They'll want blood for that, and they won't stop hunting until they get it. You're talking about a war we can't win. Maybe, but at least we'd be fighting it on our terms in a place of our choosing." He turned to face her fully, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his gray eyes, a kind of cold calculation that spoke of violence accepted and embraced. "I won't spend the rest of my life running, Nerissa. I won't let them take you again." Before she could respond, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the water. Dashiell threw himself sideways, tackling Nerissa to the ground as a second bullet whined over their heads. On the far bank, half hidden in the willows, muzzle flashes revealed at least 3 shooters. "Grimm's men?" Nerissa gasped. "Has to be." Dashiell crawled toward their horse, which was dancing nervously at the water's edge. "They must have circled around during the night. Got ahead of us somehow." More shots rang out, kicking up geysers of mud and stone around their position. They were pinned down in the open with nowhere to run and no cover except the slight depression, where years of flooding had carved a shallow channel. "We can't stay here," Nerissa said, pressing herself flat against the earth. "Working on it." Dashiell had reached their horse and was pulling his rifle from the saddle scabbard. It was a Winchester repeater, good for 15 shots if he made them all count. "When I start shooting, you get to that boulder downstream. Can you make it?" "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." The lie came easily, but she heard it anyway. Saw it in the way he checked his ammunition, in the set of his shoulders, as he prepared to make his stand. "Dash, no, we go together or not at all. This isn't a discussion." His voice carried an authority she'd never heard before, the tone of a man who'd already made peace with death. You get to safety, and you'd keep running. It's Mexico, California, wherever the trail takes you. Find a good man who can give you the life you deserve. "I already found him," she said fiercely, "and I'm not losing him to some misguided notion of heroic sacrifice." Nerissa, the word was cut off by another volley from across the river. This time the shots came closer, close enough to spray them both with dirt and pebbles. "Ah, they're attackers. We're finding the range," and it was only a matter of time before luck ran out. "There's another way," Nerissa said suddenly, her voice tight with desperate inspiration. "What? The old Apache trail? My father told me about it when I was young. A path that follows the river north, hidden by the bluffs. If we can reach it, how far? Quarter mile, maybe less." She pointed toward a break in the rocks, where shadows suggested a narrow passage. "But we'd have to cross open ground to reach it." Dashiell studied the terrain, calculating angles and distances with the cold precision of a man who'd learned to think like prey. It was possible barely. If they moved fast, and if his shooting was good enough to keep their pursuers' heads down. "All right," he said. "But if I go down, you keep running. Promise me." "I promise," she lied, knowing she'd die. Before she left him behind, Dashiell rose to one knee, the Winchester coming up smooth and fast. His first shot took one of the hidden gunmen a lucky hit that silenced one muzzle flash permanently. His second and third shots were aimed to wound and scatter, buying them precious seconds of confusion. "Now," he shouted. They ran like their lives depended on it because they did. Bullets whined around them as they sprinted across the broken ground, their feet finding purchase on stones slick with morning dew. Behind them, angry voices shouted orders as Grimm's men realized their quarry was escaping. The Apache trail was exactly where Nerissa had said. It would be a narrow cut through the bluffs that older peoples had used to move unseen along the river. It was barely wide enough for 2 people walking single file, but it offered something they desperately needed: cover as they plunged into the shadowy passage. Dashiell allowed himself one moment of hope. Maybe they could disappear into the maze of canyons and arroyos that scarred this part of Texas. Maybe they could find a place to rest. To plan their next move? Maybe they could survive this after all. The hidden canyon where they finally stopped had once sheltered Apache war parties and Spanish conquistadors, and now it offered refuge to two fugitives whose only crime was refusing to accept that love could be bought and sold like cattle. Nerissa collapsed beside the small spring that bubbled up from the rocks, her strength finally giving out after 2 days of running. Dashiell kept watch at the canyon mouth, his rifle ready, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. They'd lost Grimm's men in the maze of trails and false passages, but he knew it was only temporary. Professional trackers didn't give up easily, especially when their reputation and their lives depended on completing the job. "How much ammunition do you have left?" Nerissa asked, joining him at his vigil. "Enough for one good fight," he replied, which meant not nearly enough if Grimm's surviving men caught up with them. "And after that?" Dashiell was quiet for a long moment, watching shadows move across the canyon walls as clouds drifted overhead. Finally, he reached into his shirt and pulled out a small Derringer lady's gun, nickel-plated and elegant. "After that, we make sure they can't take you back," he said quietly. Nerissa stared at the little pistol, understanding immediately what he was suggesting. The ultimate escape, the final choice that would put her forever beyond the reach of men who saw women as property to be owned and used. "It won't come to that," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, won't it? Dashiell turned to face her, and she saw the weight of their situation in his eyes. "We're trapped in a box canyon with one way out. They'll find us eventually, and when they do, ... double quotes, when they do, we'll fight together." She took the Derringer from his hands and checked the action with movements he'd taught her during their courting days, when Sunday afternoons meant target practice and stolen kisses, but not like this. It's not giving up before the battle's even begun. "I won't let them take you alive," he said flatly, "and I won't let you die for me." She met his gaze with steady green eyes. "We're going to get out of this, Dash, both of us. Together." Before he could argue, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, not the thunder of many horses, but the careful approach of men who knew their quarry was cornered. Dashiell raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at the narrow opening that served as both entrance and exit to their sanctuary. "Montclair," a voice called out, magnified by the stone walls. "We know you're in there. Send out the girl, and we'll make it quick." Dashiell recognized the speaker Wade Carver, Grimm's foreman, a man with a reputation for brutality that made even hardened cowboys nervous. If Carver was leading the pursuit, it meant they'd brought their best tracker and their most ruthless killer. "Counteroffer," Chell shouted back. "Right away now, and I won't kill the rest of you." Harsh laughter answered him. Big words from a dead man. "You cost us our boss and half our crew. Think we're just going to let that slide?" Grimm got what he deserved. Maybe so. But the girl's still property, legal and proper. We got papers that say so. Papers don't mean shit when the man who signed them is worm food. It's more laughter, but this time with an edge of uncertainty. Carver was probably wondering exactly how many men he'd lost in that fight, exactly how dangerous the cornered ranch hand might be. "Tell you what, Montclair, send out the girl, and we'll make sure you get a proper burial. It's more courtesy than you deserve." Dashiell felt Nerissa's hand on his shoulder, warm and steady, despite everything they'd been through. When he looked at her, she was smiling, not the broken expression of a woman facing doom, but the fierce grin of someone who decided to go down fighting. "What?" he asked. "I just remembered something my Apache grandmother used to tell me," she said, her voice carrying a note of wild hope. "About this canyon? About why the spring never runs dry, even in the worst droughts?" "Nerissa, this isn't the time for it's exactly the time." She pointed toward the back wall of the canyon, where shadows hid what might have been a crack in the stone. "Grandmother said there were 2 ways in and out of every sacred place, 'cause the spirits needed an escape route when the world got too dangerous." Dashiell stared at the wall, seeing what she was seeing, not solid rock, but a cleverly concealed passage that would be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "Think it leads anywhere useful?" he asked. "Only one way to find out?" "Nerissa, was already moving toward the hidden opening, her movements quick and purposeful. But it has to be better than sitting here waiting to die. Outside, Carver was growing impatient. Last chance, Montclair. Send her out, or we're coming in. Come! Ahead. Dashiell called back, but he was already following Nerissa toward the back of the canyon. I got plenty of bullets for all of you. Da-da-da, the crack in the wall was wider than it appeared, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Beyond it lay another passage, this one sloping upward toward what might have been daylight. Apache emergency exit, Nerissa whispered, just like grandmother said. They could hear men entering the canyon behind them, boots scraping on stone, voices, calling out coordinates as they searched for targets. In minutes, maybe seconds, Carver and his men would realize their quarry had vanished like smoke. Dashiell squeezed through the crack first and helped Nerissa navigate the narrow opening. The passage beyond was tight and winding, but it led steadily upward toward what was definitely sunlight filtering through stone. Behind them, angry shouts echoed as their pursuers discovered the empty canyon. But by then, Dashiell and Nerissa were already climbing toward freedom. Toward the high mesa, where they could see their enemies coming from miles away, the game of cat and mouse was about to become something entirely different. The mesa top stretched before them like a natural fortress, wind-carved stone and sparse grass offering both concealment and commanding views in every direction. From their position, 300 feet above the canyon floor, Dashiell could see Carver's men spreading out in a search pattern, their frustration evident even at a distance. They'll find the passage eventually, Nerissa said, settling beside him behind a boulder that offered perfect cover. Eventually, Dashiell agreed, checking his rifle one more time. But up here, we've got the advantage. They'll have to come at a single file through that crack, and I can pick them off one by one. Or we could keep running, she suggested, though without much conviction. They'd been running for 3 days, and exhaustion was taking its toll on both of them. Where? Dashiell gestured toward the endless expanse of desert and badlands that surrounded them. There's nowhere left to run, Nerissa. There's no towns that'll take us in, no law that'll protect us. Yes. Grimm's money reaches farther than we ever could. She was quiet for a moment, studying his profile against the harsh blue sky. The gentle ranch hand she'd fallen in love with was still there, but he'd been transformed by necessity into something harder, more dangerous. A man capable of killing to protect what he loved. Do you regret it? She asked suddenly. Buying me from that auction? The blood that's been spilled because of it. Dashiell turned to look at her, and she saw something in his gray eyes that made her breath catch not regret, but a fierce, protective love that would burn down the world before it let her come to harm. Never, he said simply, not for one second. You're worth every drop of blood, every bullet, every sleepless night. You're worth everything I am and everything I'll ever be. Before she could respond, a rifle shot cracked from below, the bullet striking sparks from the rock near their heads. Carver had found the passage and was sending up advance scouts to test their defenses. So much for the talking portion of the evening, Dashiell muttered, settling into a comfortable shooting position. The first man to emerge from the hidden passage never knew what hit him. Dashiell's bullet took him center mass, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back into the crack. The second man was smarter, staying low and using what cover he could find. But the mesa top offered precious little concealment from a marksman with the high ground. That's 2, Dashiell said, working. The Winchester's lever action? How many left? Too many. He sighted down the barrel at another muzzle flash. But everyone we drop here is one less hunting us tomorrow. The battle for the mesa top raged for an hour, with Carver's men trying desperately to establish a foothold on the high ground, while Dashiell's deadly accurate shooting kept them pinned in the passage. But ammunition was running low, and eventually the numbers would tell. Dash, Nerissa said quietly, during a lull in the fighting. Look. She was pointing toward the eastern horizon, where a dust cloud marked the approach of more riders. A lot. More riders, moving fast and purposeful across the desert floor. Reinforcements? Dashiell asked, though he already knew the answer. Has to be. Carver must have sent word to every gun for hire in 3 counties. She counted the dust trails, her face growing pale. 20 men, maybe more. Dashiell did his own count and came up with the same number. 20 fresh gunmen to replace the ones he'd killed. I told them no. Eager to claim the bounty that Grimswell probably offered for their capture. We're not going to shoot our way out of this one, he said quietly. No, she agreed. We're not. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their doom approach across the desert. Strange how peaceful it felt, this moment before the final battle.
Strange.
How right it seemed to face the end together, here on this ancient stone platform where the wind sang through carved rock and the sky stretched infinite overhead. I love you, Nerissa, said her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. I love you too, Dashiell replied. More than life, more than anything. Then let's make them remember us. She picked up her rifle, checking the action with movements that had become second nature. Let's make them understand what it costs to buy and sell human hearts. The reinforcements were close now, close enough to make out individual riders and count weapons. But as they approached the base of the mesa, something unexpected happened. The lead rider raised his hand, calling a halt. And from his position came the sound of a bugle knot, the attack signal Dashiell expected. But the more complex notes of a military call. That's not Carver's men, Nerissa said, squinting into the afternoon glare. No, Dashiell agreed, his heart beginning to pound with sudden hope. That's the cavalry, literal cavalry. The blue uniforms were visible now, along with the guidon that marked them as federal troops rather than local law enforcement. And riding at their head, his silver hair glinting in the sunlight, was a man Dashiell, recognized from wanted posters and newspaper accounts. Colonel Marcus Steele, the Army's chief investigator of territorial corruption. The man who'd cleaned up 3 counties and sent a dozen crooked officials to federal prison. As the soldiers surrounded the mesa, Carver and his remaining men found themselves caught between the hammer and the anvil. Federal justice had arrived in the Texas Badlands, and nothing would ever be the same. The trial was held in the federal courthouse in Austin, with Colonel Steele himself serving as chief prosecutor. The charges against Barnabas Grimm's estate were extensive: illegal slavery, conspiracy to defraud, murder, and corruption of local officials. But the most damning evidence came from Grimm's own records, discovered in his ranch house safe after the fire. Gentlemen of the jury, Steele said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The deceased Mr. Grimm kept meticulous records of his criminal enterprises. Bills of sale for human beings, payments to corrupt officials, even a ledger detailing which local debtors might provide suitable merchandise for his illegal auctions. Dashiell sat in the witness chair, his testimony complete, watching the faces of the 12 men who would decide their fate. Some looked skeptical, the idea that a simple ranch hand could successfully challenge a cattle baron's empire seemed too fantastic to believe. But others, particularly the younger men, watched him with something approaching admiration. The defense would have you believe, Steele continued, that Mr. Montclair was nothing more than a common criminal who murdered an innocent businessman. But the evidence tells a different story entirely. It tells the story of systematic human trafficking, disguised as debt collection and legitimized by corrupted law enforcement. In the gallery, Nerissa sat with Doc Henley and a handful of other Weatherford citizens who'd come forward once federal protection was assured. Their testimonies had painted a picture of systematic abuse stretching back years. Young women sold to settle family debts, local law enforcement paid to look the other way, and a reign of terror that had kept an entire community silent. The defense attorney, a nervous man named Patterson who'd been appointed by the court, made what effort he could. But how do you defend a dead man's reputation when his own ledgers detail years of human trafficking? Mr. Montclair acted in self-defense, Patterson argued weakly. But that doesn't change the fact that he killed a man and destroyed property. Worth thousands of dollars? Property? Colonel Steele's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Are you referring to the cattle scattered during the rescue, counselor? Or are you referring to Miss Rosewood herself? The question hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Patterson's face went pale as he realized his mistake, and even the skeptical jurors began to look uncomfortable. "The cattle, of course," Patterson stammered. "I would never suggest, yet that's exactly what your client's business model suggested," Steele replied coldly. "That human beings could be owned, bought, and sold like livestock. The very foundation of his enterprise was built on that assumption." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, their foreman, a weathered rancher named Coleman, stood with a piece of paper in his trembling hands. "We find the defendant, Dashiell Montclair, not guilty on all charges," he announced. "Furthermore, we recommend that the federal government investigate every auction held in this territory over the past 5 years, and that all persons sold under similar circumstances be immediately freed and compensated." The courtroom erupted. In cheers and applause, Doc Henley stood and whistled through his teeth, while several women in the gallery wept openly. Dashiell only had eyes for Nerissa, who was pushing through the crowd toward him with tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she said, throwing her arms around him. "It's finally over." "Yes," he agreed, holding her close. "But what comes next?" Colonel Steele approached them as the crowd began to disperse, his weathered face creased with something that might have been a smile. "I have a proposition for you both," he said. "The Army needs good people in the territory's people who understand justice and aren't afraid to fight for it." "What kind of work?" Dashiell asked cautiously. "The kind that matters. Investigating corruption, protecting the innocent, making sure what happened here doesn't happen anywhere else." Steele's eyes were serious. "It's dangerous work, but it pays. Well, and more importantly, it gives men like you a chance to make a real difference." Dashiell looked at Nerissa, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her green eyes. They'd fought so hard to be free, to be together. Or did they really want to risk it all again by taking on the corruption that plagued the frontier? "We'd be together?" Nerissa asked. "Inseparable," Steele confirmed. "The Army's learned that the best investigators work in pairs, someone to watch your back, someone who shares your commitment to justice. And we'd be protecting people like—" Nerissa gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. "Like you were," Steele said gently. "People who can't protect themselves, who need someone willing to stand between them and the wolves." 3 months later, Deputy Federal Marshals Dashiell and Nerissa Montclair rode into the mining town of Silver Creek, Colorado, following reports of missing women and mysterious debts that could only be paid in human currency. They wore matching badges and carried matching Colts, and when the local sheriff tried to intimidate them with hired guns, he learned very quickly that some lessons from Texas travel well. The brothel owner who'd been buying kidnapped women found himself facing federal charges and a jury that included 3 women in innovation that Nerissa had suggested and Colonel Steele had enthusiastically endorsed. The corrupt officials who'd enabled the trafficking discovered that federal prison was considerably less comfortable than their private offices, and when it was over, when justice had been served and the victims freed, Dashiell and Nerissa stood on the hotel balcony watching the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, her head on his shoulder and his arms around her waist. "Any regrets?" she asked, echoing the question she'd posed on that mesa top, what seemed like a lifetime ago. "About what?" "Leaving ranch work behind? Becoming a federal marshal? Marrying the most dangerous woman in 3 territories? About all of it? About choosing this life instead of something safe and quiet?" Dashiell was quiet for a moment, considering. Below them, Silver Creek was returning to normal, where women could walk the streets without fear, where debts were paid in money rather than flesh, where justice meant more than whoever could afford the biggest gun. "No regrets," he said finally. "This is what we were meant to do, Nerissa. This is who we were meant to be. Partners in justice," she said, smiling at the phrase that had become their unofficial motto. "Partners in everything," he corrected, kissing the top of her head. In the distance, a train whistle announced the arrival of the evening express, carrying news from the outside world and perhaps reports of new injustices that needed correcting. Tomorrow, they might be riding toward another corrupt town, another fight against those who preyed on the innocent. But tonight, they were simply Dashiell and Nerissa Montclair, watching the stars come out over a town they'd helped make safe. Tonight, they were exactly where they belonged, together, free. and ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The ranch hand who'd seen her sold had indeed fought for her amidst tears and dust. But more than that, he'd helped her become someone who could fight for others, someone who could ensure that no other woman would face what she'd faced. Some love stories end with a wedding. Theirs had begun with a marriage of hearts and purpose that would echo through the frontier territories for years to come, bringing justice to the lawless and hope to the hopeless. And if their legend grew in the telling, if cowboys around, campfires spoke of the federal marshals who'd cleaned up 3 territories and never lost a prisoner. Well, some stories were worth the embellishment, some love was worth the legend.